You were never meant to fit in, not because you're broken, but because you were built to see what others deny, dismiss, or simply can't feel. You walk into a room and something just clicks. Not the words, the energy, the fake smiles, the subtle shifts, the unspoken tension no one else notices. But you do, every time. You don't know how you know, you just do. You read between lines that were never written. You sense when someone's hurting, even when they say they're fine. You predict the fallout of a situation before it even begins. And yet, you stay silent. Because every time you've tried to explain what you see, what you feel, you've been met with blank stares, dismissal, laughter. So over time, you learn to keep it in, to carry the weight of seeing too much alone. And at first, that made you feel powerful, special, different. But now, it's starting to hurt. Because when you see so much and speak so little, the world begins to fade. You stop trying to connect. You start slipping further inward. And what was once your gift starts to feel like a curse. Carl Jung had a name for people like you. He didn't call you broken. He didn't call you crazy. He called you an intuitive introvert. And he didn't just describe you. He warned about you. Not because you were dangerous to others, but because you were dangerous to yourself, if misunderstood. This isn't some clickbait personality type. This is a deep psychological profile, one Jung feared would unravel if not taken seriously. Because when the world ignores people like you don't just drift away. You begin to watch it burn from the outside. Or worse, you start lighting matches of your own, and that's where the real story begins. You feel everything, but you've been taught to say nothing. You carry a gift the world treats like a flaw. Stay with us to know the solution. What if the very thing they told you to suppress was never meant to be hidden? Carl Jung didn't see the mind as a chaotic blur of thoughts and impulses. He saw it as a structure, a vast psychological architecture shaped by ancient patterns. Archetypes, he called them. The wise old man, the mother, the rebel, the hero, the shadow. These were not just literary devices or metaphors. To Jung, they were imprints, blueprints of the human condition, invisible forms that repeat themselves across cultures, across centuries, across souls. But there was one archetype that slipped through the cracks of society's attention. Not because it was unimportant, but because it was unclassifiable. The intuitive introvert. We are not merely someone who's quiet, not just a person who prefers books over parties, but an individual wired to live in the unseen. Their primary lens on the world is intuition, a gut-level processing of patterns, symbols, energies, and potential futures. And they process all of this within. Jung believed this type lives in a world of abstraction. They don't just observe the present, they anticipate what's coming. They don't just read words, they read intention. They don't just react, they reflect deeply. But in a culture obsessed with immediacy, visibility, and performance, the intuitive introvert disappears. They're not loud enough, not fast enough, not obvious enough. Modern psychology, like the Myers-Briggs type indicator, has echoed this concept. Think INFJ, INFP, INTJ, types known for quiet insight and long-term vision. But what Jung warned wasn't just about personality quirks. It was about what happens when this archetype is ignored, dismissed, or misunderstood by the larger world. Because society tends to reward the extroverted sensor, the quick thinker, the doer, the seller, the one who can package ideas in simple language and charisma. But the intuitive introvert, they're still decoding the question when everyone else has already moved on. And so, they begin to feel like ghosts, like people out of sync with time, too slow for the fast, too deep for the shallow, too internal for a world that measures value by what can be seen and sold. But Jung knew better. He knew that this archetype, if left unsupported, wouldn't just retreat. It would ferment, it would deepen, and eventually, it would erupt. Because the mind of an intuitive introvert is not empty space. It's a pressure chamber. And when what lives inside is constantly denied by the outside, something breaks. Or worse, Something transforms. Carl Jung didn't see intuitive introverts as fragile or socially awkward. He saw them as sensitive instruments, tuned not to what's loud, but to what's real, to the subtext, the silence, the things people try to hide but can't. And that's the real curse. Not being blind to what others see, but seeing what others are blind to. It begins early. You're the child who notices the tension between your parents long before they ever fight. You're the teenager who picks up on social dynamics others miss. The fake smiles, the invisible power games, the hierarchy unspoken but deeply felt. You try to warn someone, try to speak up, but they brush it off. They laugh. They call you sensitive, paranoid, dramatic, so you stop speaking, but you don't stop seeing. Instead, you internalize it. You start thinking, maybe something's wrong with me. But the truth is, you're just perceiving too much. The intuitive introvert doesn't experience the world in slices. They experience it all at once. Emotion, tone, memory, possibility. They feel it before they can explain it. And in a world that only believes what can be measured or marketed, that kind of knowing is lonely. Imagine being an empath in a toxic family. You feel everyone's pain so deeply it makes your own body ache. But you're told to stop overreacting, to stay out of adult matters. You end up carrying emotions that don't even belong to you, and no one ever thanks you for it, because they don't even realize what you've done. Or think of the quiet visionary in a corporate meeting. They suggest an idea no one understands. Months later, someone else brings up the same idea, and suddenly it's genius. But the introvert stays silent, again. Or the teen who sees patterns, who understands that the social hierarchy at school isn't about popularity, it's about survival. They act differently, think differently, and because of that, they're labeled as weird, outcast, isolated. This is the toll of high perception. You don't get rewarded for seeing, you get punished. And over time, you start to wonder if maybe ignorance really is bliss. Jung believed that intuitive introverts weren't misfits by nature. They became misfits because the world refused to meet them where they lived, in depth. And when your mind constantly swims in the unspoken, it's easy to feel like you're drowning alone. Not because you can't reach others, but because no one even notices you're underwater. Carl Jung believed that we all carry a shadow, a part of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. It holds the impulses we suppress, the desires we deny, the truths we can't bear to admit. And when we don't face this shadow, we don't make it disappear. We project it onto others. That's where the intuitive introvert comes in. Because in a world that hides its darkness under the surface, those who see beneath that surface become dangerous. Not because they are malicious, but because they remind everyone else of what they've buried. Society doesn't fear the intuitive introvert because they are strange. It fears them because they are revealing. They don't play the game. They don't follow the script. They don't laugh at what everyone else finds funny, and they don't pretend not to notice when something feels off. And that makes them a threat. So the world finds ways to neutralize them. It starts with isolation, then labeling, then ridicule. If that doesn't work, it moves to moral judgment. They're called arrogant, problematic, dangerous. Not because of anything they've done, but because of what they expose simply by existing. Jung saw this pattern play out in all of history, from religious heretics to political dissidents to artists ahead of their time. The masses need someone to offload their unconscious fears onto. And the intuitive introvert, quiet, unreadable, different, is the perfect screen. Think of the bullied loner in school. They didn't dress wrong or act wrong. They simply didn't reflect the image the group needed to feel comfortable. So they were made into the villain. Think of the whistleblower who speaks out against corruption, the philosopher who questions the structure, the scientist who challenges sacred beliefs. Society doesn't thank them. It silences them, labels them mad, difficult, or extreme. Because when someone shines a light on the collective shadow, the first instinct isn't gratitude, it's revenge. Jung warned that intuitive introverts become magnets for this shadow projection. They often carry the weight of society's unconscious darkness. And the tragedy is, they start to believe it. They internalize the rejection, the confusion, the hate. They think, maybe I am the problem. But they are not. They are simply mirrors, held up to a society that can't bear to see its own face. And in a world full of curated identities and suppressed truths, what's more terrifying than someone who sees everything and can't be fooled? There is a war that never makes the headlines, a war fought not on battlefields, but inside people, inside minds, quietly, relentlessly, invisibly. It begins with a feeling, a sense that something isn't right, that a person's words don't match their energy, that a situation is headed toward collapse, even when everyone insists it's fine. The intuitive introvert notices these things before they're obvious, before they can be explained. But here's the problem. They can't prove it. And in a world obsessed with evidence, what cannot be proven is treated as fiction. So they begin to question themselves. Did I imagine it? Am I being too sensitive? Too negative? Too dramatic? This is where the gaslighting begins. Not always intentionally. Sometimes from people who mean well. Sometimes from institutions designed to preserve the illusion of order. Sometimes from family, friends, teachers, professionals. Anyone who is uncomfortable with inconvenient truths. Over time, the intuitive introvert starts to internalize this doubt. They learn to distrust their own compass, to override their own instincts. They begin to believe the story that says, if you can't explain it, it must not be real. But Carl Jung knew otherwise. He warned that repressing one's intuitive voice, especially in highly perceptive individuals, doesn't make it disappear. It mutates. It becomes anxiety, depression, self-loathing, or worse, it fragments the personality. One part sees clearly, while the other part insists it's blind. This inner division creates suffering that has no language, no diagnosis, no roadmap. Imagine seeing through people's masks every day, yet being told you're just imagining it. Imagine knowing when danger is coming, but no one listens until it's too late. Imagine carrying warnings that nobody believes. Eventually, you either become silent or you snap, and that's when the world calls you unstable. The tragedy isn't that intuitive introverts are wrong, it's that they are right too early. And when a person's truth doesn't match the world's timeline, the world doesn't adjust. It punishes, it invalidates, it shames. So the intuitive becomes the enemy of their own mind. The voice that was once their guide becomes a ghost they fear. This is the battlefield Jung warned about, a place where inner knowing fights outer denial. And too often, the casualty is the self. Carl Jung never said intuition was a gift without consequence. He respected its power, but he feared what happened when that power went unchecked, ungrounded, and unintegrated. His greatest warning wasn't about being too quiet or too sensitive or too inward. It was about what happens when the intuitive introvert becomes trapped in their own mind. Because intuition without grounding becomes fantasy, and deep insight without confrontation becomes delusion. Jung believed every human being carries a shadow, a dark double made of repressed emotions, fears, and impulses. It's not evil, it's natural, but it's dangerous when denied. For intuitive introverts who already live more inside than out, this shadow often grows unchecked. It whispers in metaphors. It wears the face of insight, but it's really fear disguised as truth. The intuitive introvert begins to isolate, not just physically, but psychologically. They believe no one understands them. They believe they see what others can't. They believe the world is too shallow, too corrupt, too ignorant, and maybe some of that is true. But here lies the danger. Once the mind becomes a kingdom of one, everything else becomes the enemy. What starts as sensitivity can mutate into superiority. What begins as caution can curdle into paranoia. You stop trusting others, then you stop trusting yourself. You read between the lines so often, you forget how to read what's actually there. This is the descent Jung feared. When the intuitive, instead of becoming a light in the dark, becomes consumed by the dark they tried to understand. They may grow bitter, cynical, even manipulative, seeing people as pawns, interpreting kindness as weakness, using their insight not to help, but to control or withdraw completely. They become ghosts of their own potential, trapped in theory, lost in abstraction, convinced they are awake while sleepwalking through their own illusions. Jung warned, "The mind is not a temple unless you clean the corners. Otherwise, it becomes a tomb." Integration means facing the shadow, owning your darkness, admitting that even your intuition is not infallible, that you're not just a visionary, you are also human. And if you forget that, you lose yourself to the very thing you were trying to escape. Look around. We live in a world that moves faster than thought. Attention spans measured in seconds. Algorithms rewarding the loudest, not the wisest. Visibility mistaken for value. In this kind of society, where does the intuitive introvert fit? They don't, not easily. Because the intuitive doesn't offer a 5-second answer. They offer depth, and depth takes time, something most people don't believe they have. They speak in patterns, not slogans. Their insights are layered, not viral. Their truths are often uncomfortable, rarely convenient. And so, they are ignored, dismissed, muted. But here's the irony. Many of the voices we revere today were once ridiculed. Nietzsche, exiled by academia. Emily Dickinson, unread in her lifetime. Van Gogh, considered insane. These weren't just artists or thinkers. They were intuitive minds. They felt what others couldn't explain. They saw what others refused to see. And for that, they paid a price. Only in hindsight do we call them geniuses. Only in retrospect do we admit they were right. So ask yourself, how many intuitive voices are we silencing today? Not with censorship, but with indifference. How many people are dismissed simply because they don't speak the language of speed, marketability, or ease? Jung saw it coming. A culture obsessed with appearances would reject those who live in essence. And perhaps the greatest tragedy isn't that these minds go unheard. It's that the world doesn't realize what it's losing until it's already lost. Maybe you've always felt a step removed from the world, like you're watching from the edge of the room, even when you're standing in the center. Maybe you feel things too deeply, notice things too early, hear meaning in silences louder than words. If that sounds like you, then maybe this wasn't just a story. Maybe it was a mirror. You're not broken, you're not overreacting, and you're not alone. You are what Carl Jung would call an intuitive introvert, and that doesn't make you weak. It makes you sensitive to truth in a world addicted to illusion. But here's the catch. Sensitivity without structure becomes suffering. Insight without grounding becomes instability. If you don't learn to protect your mind, the world will invade it. If you don't learn to trust your gift, others will convince you it's a curse. So start small. Set boundaries with people who drain you. Find stillness, not just to escape, but to integrate. Seek out communities that don't just tolerate depth, but crave it. You were not designed to fit in. You were born to see what others can't. But that vision needs strength behind it. Clarity, purpose, resilience. Jung didn't write for the masses. He wrote for the few who feel like you do. Don't let the noise of the world drown out the voice within you, and above all, don't let the world shame you for being awake. The world may never celebrate the ones who see beneath the surface. It may never fully understand them, or reward them, or even recognize them. But it needs them, desperately. Because without the seers, the feelers, the quiet ones who catch what slips through the cracks, society becomes blind to its own reflection. So if you've ever felt invisible, remember this. You were never meant to be a mirror for the crowd. You were meant to be a window to what lies beneath. Don't dim your light just because it burns differently. Don't hide your voice because it doesn't echo back applause. Don't kill your gifts just to make others comfortable. Jung didn't just map the mind. He handed you a key, a survival guide for the misunderstood, a call to remember that just because the world is loud doesn't mean it's right. You are not broken. You are not too much. You are simply ahead of your time. And one day when the noise dies down and the world begins to hunger for meaning again, it will come looking for voices like yours. Be ready. This video surely made you think differently. You're not alone. There's more coming. Subscribe for deeper dives into the truths most people avoid, and hit the bell so you don't miss what's next.